Okay, so I want to talk about something called free market environmentalism. After 21 years, or 45 years, hopefully that odd title will become clear as I go along. But one of the things that I want to do is trace out some Canadian contributions, early Canadian contributions to an idea called free market environmentalism. And I was asked before I started, have we ever had free market environmentalism? Has it been around for 21 years? The ideas have been around, and the practice has been around on a limited basis as well. So I'm going to talk about some of the practice, but mostly about the ideas. So I want to talk about this perspective. It's a perspective on economics, and it's also a perspective on environmental stewardship, although it contrasts with conventional environmentalism and conventional economics in many respects. It's come to be called free market environmentalism. Basically, that's a book title that for a book that was published 21 years ago, 1992, but is a somewhat older idea than that. And it offers a substantially different view from both conventional economics and conventional environmentalism. So, well, compared to what? Well, I take the following 5 to be representative propositions of conventional environmentalism. Environmental degradation is occurring globally at an excessive and perhaps accelerating rate. Businesses and consumers tend to act without regard to stewardship of the natural environment on a daily basis. Economists promote economic growth regardless of the consequences for the ecosystem, so economists are cheerleaders for this process for the most part. David Suzuki has famously said repeatedly that economics is a form of brain damage. He's been saying this since the 1970s. Some noble individuals have made minor contributions to the preservation of the natural world, and they should be encouraged, but these actions alone are insignificant relative to the size of the problem, and it is only national governments, ideally guided by international agencies and conventions, that have any hope of fixing the problem. So those are my 5 propositions of conventional environmentalism.
Hey, you forgot to genuflect and make the sign of the cross.
Well, there are atheists and there are religious versions of this, and so it was hard to put all those into one axiom. There are also some similar propositions in conventional economics, and I want to skewer those a little bit, or at least contrast free market environmentalism from these views. And the first proposition was, in the beginning, there was perfect competition. Perfect competition leads to efficiency, and this is good. Departures from the conditions required for perfect competition constitute something called market failures. Market failures are all around us. Government action should undo the effects of these market failures. In fact, it's the only way that we have to fix these market failures. And many market failures are related to environmental problems are examples of market failures. Okay? But I want to digress a little bit here and tell you a story, an experience that I had in the Black Forest in Germany in 1990. Okay? I was part of a delegation of University of Guelph faculty that were sent to meet our counterparts in Germany and the Netherlands. The short version of the story is that there was a vice president at Guelph, and he and I didn't get along very well. He became aware of this opportunity and thought, what better way to get fox out of my hair for a period of weeks this summer than send him to Europe? Maybe he won't come back. So I tried to get out of it, but I couldn't get out of it, so I went there. Now, we were there over some weekends, and on the Sunday, some of us were sitting around, and we thought, well, we should do something. So we rented a van and got our German hosts to take us on a tour in the Black Forest. Okay, so we're driving around, and it's quite a wonderful experience. But several of my colleagues became powerfully consumed by thirst during the day and sought an opportunity to obtain a refreshing beverage. Our German host said, we know just the spot. We parked the van and we had to walk across a bridge into to this town. So picture the situation. There's basically a 4-lane expressway and a like a parking lot like we have for, what do they call it? Carpool.
Park and ride?
Yeah. Then there's a footbridge that goes across this river to a walled town. So this is an old town. They've diverted the river so it's like a moat. We have to go across the footbridge into the river, hence the establishment with the refreshing beverages. So I'm partway across, and this isn't the town, but this is illustrative of the town. I didn't have a camera with me, but it kind of looked like that. And partway across this bridge, I froze. I stopped. I looked down into the water and was absolutely transfixed by what I saw. Now, I should explain to you a little bit. I was wearing polarized sunglasses. Anybody know what polarized sunglasses do?
See the fish.
Yeah, you can see the fish. Yeah, you know where the story's going. Polarized sunglasses help you see through the glare on the surface of the water. You can see what's below the surface. So what I saw below the surface of the water was a magnificent school of brown trout, much bigger than this pathetic little specimen, probably even bigger than this one. And these fish are just lazily swimming in the river under this footbridge. And everybody else literally walked off into town, and I just stood there on the bridge. They got into the bar. By the way, I hope that's not a surprise to anybody that that's where they were going on a Sunday afternoon. But that's where they were going, and the German host realized, oops, we've lost one. What are we going to do? How are we going to explain to our chancellor we lost the professor from Canada? Great panic ensued, and they retraced their steps. They found me still standing in the middle of this bridge looking in the river, and they were deeply concerned about my well-being. They thought, you know, do you need medical attention? Are you having a seizure? Should we take you to the hospital? What is wrong? And I said, look at that. Look down in the water. And they said, yeah, we're looking down in the water. We think maybe we should go to the hospital. They couldn't understand what I thought was interesting. So I explained to them that if I witnessed that situation in Canada, well, I never witnessed that situation in Canada, but if that situation occurred in Canada, there would be a rows of fishermen on both sides of the river with fishing rods trying to catch those fish, and the fish would be very quickly gone. And now it was the Germans' chance to be astonished. They said, you're kidding. It would be no more likely, in their words, for that to happen than in Canada for someone to drive a truck into a farmer's field and start loading up cows without the farmer's permission. I said, really? Why is that? They went on to explain that somebody owned those fish. Now, they didn't know who owned those fish. They didn't know whether it was an individual or a family or a club or the local community, but somebody owned those fish, just the way that the farmer owned the cows. And that it was not only part of the institutions and the incentives, but part of the culture, because my German hosts were not from this town. And the people walking back and forth across the bridge were, for the most part, not fishermen. But it was part of the culture to recognize that in order to put a line in the water and try and catch these fish, you would have to go get somebody's permission, probably pay them, and you might not be able to get permission even if you offered to pay. And the consequence was stewardship. This was the best school of brown trout I've ever seen in my life. And I've spent a lot of time with polarized glasses looking into rivers in North America. Okay? So it just impressed upon me the connection between institutions and culture and incentives and stewardship. And it made me ask myself this question, and in some respects, this question has absorbed most of my life since 1990. If natural resources can flourish in one location, under a particular form of ownership, can that happen elsewhere? Why is it that the institutions work in one case and promote stewardship? And one perspective that emphasizes the importance of this question is something called free market environmentalism, and that's basically what I want to talk about today. Now, normally this is a 12-week, one-semester, half-credit course that I teach at the University of Guelph in the winter semester, so it's a bit of an experiment. Can I get through the highlights of this in less than 12 weeks? Apparently, Matt, I have less than 12 weeks to do this, so bear with me, but I want to go through some themes. I want to talk about free market environmentalism first as a set of ideas, although my story indicates that it also is an actual experience. It offers an alternative to the conventional model of environmental policy, which dominates, for the most part, in North America. It draws on ideas from law, administration, economics, political science, and even biology. And there are some early, generally underappreciated Canadian contributions that I want to bring to your attention on this. This idea has some setbacks post-2008. Oddly enough, the financial crisis, housing crisis in the United States, has tended to undermine the credibility of what I'm talking about. That's starting to change, but it got a lot tougher to teach this stuff in 2009 than it had been for a while before that. Then I want to finish up with some questions about, well, what happens next in terms of the development of these ideas and, more importantly, the application of them. My course starts off with sort of a word association exercise. I've been doing this for a number of years. I put the words free market environmentalism on the board and ask students what their reaction is. And for the most part, it's sort of a shock reaction. This is an oxymoron. These are words that don't belong together, like military intelligence, business ethics, government efficiency, or university innovation. Those are my suggestions. They don't come up with those. But I say, yeah, these, yeah, and they say, yeah, those things all belong in the same category. This just doesn't make sense. And how is it you could possibly spend the next 12 weeks of my life talking to me about these words that don't make sense? But the reaction, I think, tells us a lot about the connotations or the meanings of those words. Right? It tells us a lot about the feelings and the ideas and the baggage that we have attached to the phrase the free market, and also environmentalism. And it tells us a lot about our history, our culture, and probably our education system when these things are seen as antithetical to one another. And so one of the themes that I examine as the course unfolds is this idea, well, why is it common for people to see free markets as the enemy of environmentalism, as the enemy of environmental protection? Okay, I said I wanted to talk about some Canadian connections. My first one is not an economist. He was a biologist. His name was CHD Doug Clark. And he did extensive research on wildlife biology, did research in the Arctic on musk oxen, and he was, at the end of his career, the chief of the Fish and Wildlife branch of what was then the Department of Lands and Forests, now the Ministry of Natural Resources of the Government of Ontario. Died in 1981 on Lake Simcoe in an ice fishing accident. So he was an avid hunter and fisherman. And that was his picture. He was in the only picture I could find of him is a picture of when he was in the military in World War II. Okay, he presented what I discovered after my German experience. I kind of came back and I thought, you know, what can this be? How can I explain this? He presented a remarkable paper at a conference in Toronto in 1967 on water pollution. And I think he was sort of narrating an experience that he had that was similar to mine, although his was in Great Britain. Okay? That he compared trout and salmon and angling in the UK and Germany to Ontario, made the same observation that I made, that it's sort of an unfavorable comparison from Ontario's point of view. A couple of quotations from his presentation. The island of Great Britain is moist and verdant and blessed with innumerable cool streams that were once the haunts of trout and salmon. Most of them still are, even though they now flow through an industrialized countryside. The total poundage of fine game fish taken would put any accessible part of Canada to shame. We are so used to the idea that the waters of any industrial area are a write-off so far as quality angling is concerned that one cannot help be curious as to how all that fishing is maintained. Okay, so in 1967, he was curious. He had the same observation that I had some years later in 1990. He explained the role of something called the Anglers Cooperative Association. Later it was the Anglers Conservation Association. I think it's now called Fish Legal. It is a relatively small but powerful and effective law firm, basically, cooperative, that litigates on behalf of fisheries rights owners, fishing rights owners, against polluters and others who would transgress against fish habitat. So the ACA represented owners of private fishing rights, which existed extensively in Britain. Again, Clark's quotation, every fishery except those in public reservoirs belonged to some private owner. Those private owners had standing, and the ACA was able to litigate on their behalf and prevent pollution and degradation. And the history of the ACA is a fascinating history to understand how they've operated and how effective they have been.
Does it have any competitors in different regions, perhaps? Different associations for different? lakes and
Not that I'm aware. I think that it's the only one. Although, I mean, somebody could go get a private law firm and do that.
Yeah. Or the
secret
private
representation.
fish.
So anybody could do that. But the Anglos Cooperative Association has been in this business for so long that they tell stories about if a polluter, if a lawyer from the ACA walks into the office of a polluter and puts his business card on the table, in 99 cases out of 100, that's the end of the story and the pollution stops.
Nice.
So it's a potent organization for something that one guy started in 1948 or somewhere around in there.
That's not bad.
And pretty low cost. So, you know, other law firms could get in that business, but why bother? Because the ACA is better and they're cheaper and they've got a track record. And then Clark made an observation which is one of the most, I think, insightful paragraphs on natural resource and environmental policy that I've ever seen once you unpack what the sentences mean. Officially, we have tried to do by statute what the British have done by common law, but never apparently have we really meant what we said. Our first legislation related to fish habitat and water quality was passed in 1865, but that same legislature that passed the 1865 legislation pulled the teeth of that. In other words, passed legislation to reduce the enforcement of water quality legislation in 1868. 3 years, pretty short half-life. It's interesting that one simply cannot conceive of a judgment or an injunction obtained through the legal action of the ACA being set aside in the way that legislative law backflipped in the Ontario context. Okay, going on with some more Canadian content. The late John Dales, professor of economics at the University of Toronto, and I'm sorry this is an unflattering picture, but John, who is now no longer with us, did not have, when he was alive, a great internet presence. So there's no Facebook page I can go to and rip off a picture of him. But he was a professor of economics at the University of Toronto, and in 1968, he published this marvelous book called Pollution, Property, and Prices. It was republished in 2001, and if you want to read one book on environmental economics, this is still at the top of my list for something to read, even though it's relatively old. He quotes and analyzes the Clark quotation. The Clark quotation is a little hard to get a hold of, but John quotes from it extensively and provides an economic and to some extent legal interpretation of the things that Clark as a biologist saw as sort of a paradox or a mystery or a question to be answered. Now, Dales is also the person who invented tradable emissions permits in 1968. Now, if the Nobel Prize in Economics were awarded to people who generated ideas that actually made people's lives better, you know, radical concept. You know, that's what they do in medicine, right? You get the Nobel Prize for inventing something that actually makes people's lives better. If they had the same criteria in economics, John Dales, when he was alive, would have been hands down best candidate for the Nobel Prize, because if there's one policy idea that economists have developed that people have actually used and has actually produced substantial environmental gains at extremely low cost, it's the concept of tradable emissions permits. I know libertarians don't like that. I'm not entirely comfortable with tradable emissions permits, but anyway, that's another thing that John is responsible for. Murray Rothbard, libertarian, Austrian economist, wrote a very important paper in 1982, Law, Property Rights, and Air Pollution. I continue to use that in my courses today. But does one of the best jobs in free market environmentalism of linking legal theories of liability with economic incentives with environmental outcomes in order to pollute or abate pollution. Has a masterful criticism of utilitarianism, a masterful criticism of COES and others. A couple of things I disagree with him with, but anyway, that's a noteworthy contribution to the free market environmentalist literature. And the free market environmentalist literature, like the Anglos Cooperative Association example, relies extensively on legal remedies against trespass and nuisance as the mechanism to reduce environmental degradation, protect habitat, and protect, in this case, air quality, but also, in the fish case, water quality. And Murray, I think, did a wonderful job, and I don't think people have given him enough credit for this, and he doesn't really come out and say that he rejects the idea of harm, which is the common legal standard in trespass and nuisance and in other areas. And he says that the criteria he uses is physical invasion of a person or a person's just property without consent, which is a much narrower, more focused, and I think better idea than the more vague and harmful concept of harm. Okay, so anyway, those are some old contributions to free market environmentalism, but Terry Anderson and Donald Leal in 1992 published this book, Free Market Environmentalism, which is probably the most recognized contribution to thinking in this area. They have operated an organization that has the acronym PERC. It's gone through a couple of different names, I think. Political Economy Research Center, I think, was the first name in Bozeman, Montana. It's a think tank. Later, they did some really interesting work and continue to do really interesting work on environmental entrepreneurship, and have done some very informative case studies on that. And because it was their book attracted so much attention in 1992, it's been around long enough that there actually now is a critical literature on this idea. Jan contributed one important essay on that, and then a critical defending literature, criticism of the criticism literature. Jan contributed to that part, not the criticism of Anderson and Leal quite so much. So it's fascinating to kind of see the pros and cons debated out in the academic literature on this. Back to Canadian contributions, Elizabeth Brubaker is a researcher at Environment Probe in Toronto. I met Elizabeth on the radio. In 1993, I was doing a radio interview, a noon-hour radio interview on the CBC, essentially doing an oral book review of Anderson and Leal's book, Free Market Environmentalism. This was supposed to be about 10 minutes. The guy hosting the show was so intrigued by everything that we talked for probably about a half an hour or 40 minutes. Elizabeth had just arrived in Toronto to take up her work as a researcher at Environment Probe. She was listening to this babbling, ridiculous professor from the University of Guelph saying all kinds of weird things about property rights and the environment. And she scribbled down notes on her kitchen table as she was making lunch and listening to this radio interview, and she decided that her first project in her new job was going to be to write a book to prove me wrong. Okay? And the product of that was Property Rights in the Defense of Nature, a delightful book that I use in class to this day. I've never had such pleasure from being proved wrong in my entire life. Of course, that wasn't the outcome. The outcome she anticipated was not the outcome that happened. She, in fact, did a considerable amount of original research documenting Canadian cases of free market environmentalism, Canadian cases where property rights had been effective in protecting the environment, and furthermore documented numerous cases where legislative law in Ontario and in Canada had overridden customary common law property rights and led to environmental degradation. All of that in this book to prove me wrong.
That's intellectual honesty right there.
It is, on her part and mine, just if I can take credit for that. But certainly, yeah, and now I'm on the board of her organization, so it all worked out in the end. And one of the points that I think Elizabeth's work demonstrates is that, and I've been teaching courses in environmental law at Guelph. We don't have a law school, but the dean looked at me as an economist and said, "You're close enough to a lawyer." So I've been teaching these environmental law courses. And the environmental law curriculum in law schools is a sort of historically odd curriculum in that it says, in the beginning, i.e. 1970, environmental law was created. And of course what they mean is federal statutes, federal legislative law in Canada and the United States. And then the rest of the curriculum starts from that genesis and moves up to the present day. Well, Elizabeth demonstrated that for hundreds of years before 1970 there was something that was effective that could be legitimately considered environmental law. Free market environmentalism contrasts with conventional economics as well as with conventional environmentalism. before he wrote Free Market Environmentalism, Terry Anderson used the language of the old resource economics versus the new resource economics. The new resource economics became Free Market Environmentalism, but 12 years before he published that book, this is the language that he was using. The old resource economics was essentially the economics of market failure. Okay? And the economics of market failure says there are things called public goods, there are things called externalities, there are things called social discount rates, and usually in quotation marks, problems with property rights, and these things cause environmental problems. And the role of government policy is to fix those things individually or altogether. And the game was match the resource use pathology with the category of market failure, apply the regulatory remedy, and happy face.
Happy face.
Happy face application. So that's what he called the old resource economics, and I'm being a little bit lighthearted in the way I describe it, but he's not completely off base. In fact, there's a lot of resource economics that's done today that still conforms to that model. However, there's some problems with the old resource economics. One is this idea of a public good. The phrase public good has a lot of different meanings, but in economics it has a very specific technical meaning. Anything that's a public good has two characteristics. It's non-rival in consumption, and here's where you start to see some of the logical ambiguities. It's either impossible or costly to exclude. Right? Possible is a little different than costly, depends on how hard you want to work at it. But non-rival in consumption is a necessary condition for something to be a public good. Now, many economists kind of tap dance a little bit and say, well, such and such is a public good because, and don't worry about the non-rivalrousness requirement. It's exceedingly difficult to find anything that actually is non-rival in consumption. Clean air is not non-rival in consumption. Two people cannot inhale the same liter of clean air at the same time. Clean water is not non-rival in consumption. Ditto, two people cannot ingest the same liter of clean water at the same time. All of the things that are frequently cited as public goods environmentally are in fact not non-rival. And unfortunately for the diagnosis of public goods, it's a double definition that you have to meet both criteria, otherwise you're not in the game. Okay? The consequences of something being a public good is what economists call the free rider problem. If something is a public good, then people who haven't contributed will want to ride the bus and not buy a ticket. If, as a result, there isn't enough revenue to pay for the bus, therefore the bus doesn't exist. As I said, the criticism is it hardly ever applies to natural resource problems. There aren't very many. A few years ago I was challenged by a class to say, well, can you think of an example? And I had to rack my brain a little bit, and I said, going back to Clark's work with the musk oxen in the Northwest Territories, I said, you may or may not know this, but there is a wilderness preserve in the Northwest Territories where the musk oxen at this moment are frolicking without any interference from humans. I said, let's all close our eyes and let's get a warm, fuzzy feeling about the musk oxen frolicking in the Northwest Territories. I said, that's a public good because all of us can contemplate and have, in fact, we have the whole university close their eyes and have this warm, fuzzy feeling about the musk oxen. And there are no less opportunities for other people to contemplate the frolicking musk oxen. So that's an example of a non-rival consumption experience. Then the next year, a student came back and brought a package to me. He said, my mother was in the Northwest Territories last year and saw this preserve, and she bought musk oxen jerky, and he gave me a package of musk oxen jerky, which I have to this day. I'm sure it's completely unsuitable for consumption, which I was never going to do. And of course, clearly he didn't quite get the idea of non-rival consumption, because the musk oxen jerky is now not non-rival consumption, that's rival consumption. So, the other problem with public goods is that frequently something's labeled with this label public good, and the assumption is that it has to be provided by the government. But of course, as you look across the world, virtually every good or service provided by the government in Canada has been provided or is provided privately by somebody somewhere else in the world or at some other point in time. So there's nothing automatic inherent in something called a public good. Externalities is the second category of market failure. The definition here is someone imposes costs on someone else with their consent. Someone imposes harm on someone else without their consent. Is the language that's often used. The solution is, well, these activities should be regulated. There should be pollution taxes. There should be tradable emissions permits so that people will take these unintended consequences into account. I think there are a number of problems with this. First, I think the concept of harm is too broad. And there are examples that I use about, I live in a small village that for a long time only had one pizza shop. And then somebody else opened a second pizza shop. And I knew the people who were running the first pizza shop, and I believe that they were harmed by this action. Well, if harm is an externality, should we have a tax on the new pizza shop? Right? Now, most people, including most economists, say no, but if harm is your criterion, there's really no sound basis for saying no. And, you know, Maple Leafs every year are harmed, their fans are harmed because they don't get to the Stanley Cup and don't win it. So should the other teams have to compensate Maple Leafs fans for their team winning the Stanley Cup? So economists arbitrarily pick and choose among the external effects that matter. Somebody mentioned earlier today about, and even if you could get the right list of harms that matter, how would you know how big person A's harm is versus person B? Because this is something that you can't observe, it's not measurable. So there's something that's missing in the theory of externalities. Why is it that costs can be imposed without consent? Conventional environmental economics is silent on that. Why do some harms matter and others don't? Again, no clear results. So externality theory in conventional environmental economics leaves these questions unanswered. And economic literature has, I think, almost systematically ignored common law remedies against trespass and nuisance. Social discount rates, in the interest of time, I think I'm just going to skip through this because this is a little bit more technical economic stuff. But if anybody wants to talk about social discount rates later, I'll give you a video. And the old resource economics does acknowledge problems with property rights. Sometimes externalities are explained as a dysfunction of something called property rights. But the economic literature on property rights I find a little bit convoluted. And it's not uncommon to find definitions that in economics that say a property right is a right, ... without even recognizing the circularity of it. Sometimes economists argue that property rights should be defined, divestible, and defendable, but they don't say where these rights come from. They don't say why they should have these 3D characteristics, who's supposed to do this, what happens if it doesn't happen. And the new resource economics, I think, is a little bit more serious about those questions of the origins of rights. The new resource economics adds to these categories of market failure, categories of policy failure, which I think is probably its most profound and important contribution. The old resource economics, again, assumed market failures, covered of regulatory remedies, match the pathology with the remedy, apply the remedy, happy face. Okay? The new resource economics says, hold on, this story's more complicated than that. Some of the environmental problems that we see are not the problems of market failures, they're the product of of legislative law, of government policies themselves. So it's really not appropriate to call that a market failure. It's really a non-market or a policy failure. Some theory has been developed on categories of non-market failure, categories of policy failure that are sort of analog, sort of parallels to the market failure categories, but not exactly the same. Arguably the most important from an environmental point of view is something called derived externalities, something that looks like a nuisance, looks like an externality, but occurs as a result of some government policy or government legislation. We have had many examples historically in Ontario. The new resource economics also uses public choice theory, which examines the importance of incentives in the political process. Economists traditionally have thought a lot about incentives in the market process. Public choice theory has said, hold on, there are incentives in the political process. Unless we understand those incentives, then we're really going to miss, we're not going to understand very well how policy actually occurs. One of my favorite examples of the demonstration or an illustration of market and non-market failure is an essay now that's quite old. I think it was 1981 by a man named Eric Zeus, who published an essay in Reason magazine called "Love Canal, the Truth Seeps Out." And I think the first line in his essay is, get ready, you're about to be untricked. And of course, for contemporary audiences, Love Canal is sort of lost in the mists of memory. I was a teenager, I was in high school and college when the Love Canal story was breaking in Niagara Falls, New York. I had relatives that lived in Niagara Falls, Canada. I lived near Hamilton. So Love Canal was front and center local news almost every night.
What was that?
It was a well, the way the story broke was children were playing in their backyard, children were playing in the schoolyard in this neighborhood called Love Canal, which is near the Niagara River in Niagara Falls, New York, and green ooze started bubbling up from the ground, and people started to get sick, and basically, eventually the whole neighborhood was demolished and covered by a big blanket of clay. There's a big chain link fence around it now, and even the neighborhoods next door, the last time I actually went there a few years ago by mistake, even the neighborhood next door, all the houses are just abandoned. And this, the story as it broke originally was this evil company called the Hooker Chemical Company, and if you're going to call a company by a name that's not going to work from a marketing point of view, the Hooker Company is probably a pretty good place to start. That the Hooker Chemical Company polluted this land, and then innocent people came along and bought their houses. They built a school and made everybody sick. Well, what Zeus did, in spite of all the investigative journalists that had gone before him, was he actually went to Niagara Falls, New York, and he started to read transcripts of the Niagara Falls School Board around the time that the Niagara Falls School Board obtained the land from Hooker Chemical to find out what really happened. And he documents the culpability of the staff and the trustees of the Niagara Falls School Board, who bought this land from Hooker for $1, were warned extensively by Hooker. It had been an industrial waste disposal site. The waste had been stored in the 1950s at standards that had not been introduced in legislation until the 1980s, so they were 30 years ahead of their time on the storage standards. It gave them extensive warnings about don't break containment of the structures that we have under the ground. All of these warnings were ignored. They punched holes in the clay linings and the concrete linings and everything else. They run sewer pipes. They sold the land off to people building houses without informing them of the history of the land. So they knew the property was contaminated. They cut costs, they cut corners, they ignored the warnings, sold it to people to build houses and so forth. And it's just a very rich case study in non-market failure, right? That I still find bears value to study today. And I think the last sentence in his essay is so insightful at many levels. Every society that privatizes benefits while socializing risks deserves every Love Canal that it gets. And I don't know how many times before, and I don't know how many times since, societies have experienced that, but there's just tremendous wisdom in Zeus's analysis. And it's a fantastic illustration of the problems of non-market failure. Okay? So the new resource economics emphasizes institutions, it emphasizes information and incentives. An increasingly common question, and this was raised in an earlier presentation today, is what's the economy worth, or what's the environment worth? We value it. How much is the value? The new resource economics argues that valuation is subjective, okay? That it's only revealed by voluntary transactions among consenting adults. And if we want to know what an environmental asset, and maybe asset's a wrong word to use, an environmental value is worth, we need an institutional setting that facilitates market exchanges in order to be able to get a glimpse at those values. And part of that institutional facilitation consists of effective sanctions against what I call boundary infractions. Okay? If you don't have a way to protect your environmental good against boundary infractions, against somebody else doing something with it against your consent, then that's not a functional institutional setting. The Anglo Cooperative Association clearly is a mechanism to deal with boundary infractions for fisheries rights owners. Okay? And then those exchanges create incentives for stewardship in free market environmentalism. Conventional economics, as I've suggested already, is somewhat different from free market environmentalism. The story with conventional economics starts from the theory of perfect competition, and according to the theory of perfect competition, we start with perfect and complete information, that everyone has perfect and complete information. Then we respond to incentives, and we act on the basis of those incentives. And if we start with perfect information and we're perfectly rational, then we get to efficiency, and that's a good thing. But if the conditions for perfect competition aren't met, which, by the way, A, they never are, and B, I would never want them to be, that's another conversation that we can have offline, then you don't get efficiency and you have a market failure. Now, Anderson and Leal proposed a slightly different, well, not a slightly different, basically a backwards version of this. Their argument is that institutions are the things that frame incentives, and those incentives then influence action, and out of that action, information is the product of market exchange. Perfect competition says we start with perfect information and then see what happens. Anderson and Leal say we don't get to the information until we have, because of this subjective valuation problem, we don't get to the information until we've actually acted and we've seen the results of the market exchanges. So a fairly significant difference in the way that they view economics. I've thought a lot about the what I call the 3I model of Anderson and Leal over the years, and I think that there may be a little bit fuller model into which their model can be embedded. And we've had some discussion of this in previous presentations today, but it seems to me that before we talk about institutions, we need to talk about ideas. Because the history of natural resource policy in Canada clearly demonstrates the influence of ideas. The way that we treat fish in one jurisdiction in Ontario, one province, is different from another because of the patterns of settlement and the historical differences in the predominant ideas. So ideas influence institutions. I like Hayek's distinction between two types of institutions, and Anderson and Leal aren't particularly precise on this, but I think this distinction between institutions that are a planned order versus a spontaneous order is a critical distinction in institutions. In either case, institutions do produce incentives. Incentives do incite action. Out of that comes information. And then, and this line, I wanted to have like a wavy, dotted, broken up, fuzzy sort of line, and my PowerPoint skills aren't that good yet, there is a bit of a feedback loop between the information that comes out of those experiences and ideas, but it might take maybe 150 years, as far as I can tell, for that feedback to kind of be effective, at least in the Ontario context. Okay? So anyway, that's the model that I end with in my course of free market environmentalism at Guelph. So let me just wrap up. So 23 years ago, this whole story started when I observed some brown trout swimming in a river in Germany, and I saw something that, to me, as a fisherman growing up in Ontario, I saw the equivalent of a physicist seeing water run uphill. I said, this can't be. I must solve this mystery. That experience has shaped much of my subsequent professional life. In my research, I came across these ideas of free market environmentalism, which is, I find, a useful framework to help understand and explain the things that I saw. I've discovered some underappreciated Canadian contributions. Most of the literature on this and most of the debate has focused on the US and to a lesser extent the United Kingdom. There was a considerable amount of momentum built in terms of free market environmentalism between 1992 and 2007. But the financial crisis in 2008, I think, represented a significant practical setback for free market, the implementation of free market environmentalism. And so I just found it a lot harder to talk to both farm groups, community groups, industry groups, and students after, I had to win back their confidence after 2008, even though, on its face, the housing crisis had nothing to do with free market environmentalism, but it's this connotation of free markets and the frequent, and I believe completely misleading claim that the 2008 financial crisis was a market failure.
Very much.
So, but I think that'll be temporary. I think even now we're seeing, I'm seeing less of that sort of pushback. But my more fundamental point is that in North American environmental policy is broken, right? And most serious scholars of environmental policy will admit this, at least at one level or another, that this flush of environmental legislative law that came out of Washington and Ottawa in the 1970s has produced for us very little in the way of environmental gains. It's created a lot of strife, a lot of litigation, or litigious type environment. So any gains which have been achieved at, in some sense, a high cost. And something needs to be done. Now, there's a lot of disagreement about what needs to be done. Some legal theorists or environmental lawyers say, well, it's just more of the same. We weren't strong enough last time. But I think free market environmentalism is a good alternative, the best alternative to consider for environmental policy being broken. And I think clearly we need a more balanced consideration of market and non-market failures. And that's true in teaching. I think it's true in the consideration of policy. One of the most revealing experiences that I had as I started to study this stuff when I was at Guelph was I was in a meeting with other faculty. And there was a new faculty member who had just finished his PhD at one of the best resource economics schools in Canada, if not the world. And in our discussion, I was talking about market failure and non-market failure. And eventually he interrupted me and he said, I know what you're talking about with market failure, but you keep mentioning this non-market failure. What is that? I've never heard of it. And as I said, freshly minted PhD, one of the best environmental resource economics programs in Canada, if not North America, if not the world, had never heard of that. So there's a ways to go in the agenda of free market environmentalism, but all we need is time and courage and tenure.
Yeah.
Peter.